Grace Sullivan woke up trapped inside her own penthouse. Every door locked, every window bulletproof. Her billionaire husband's voice echoed through the intercom. "You need rest, darling." But rest wasn't what he had planned. This is the true story of a woman who discovered her perfect marriage was actually a death sentence. A husband with three identities, a mistress who helped plan murders, and a psychiatric system used as a weapon. Grace had 72 hours to escape before her baby was born, and she disappeared forever. Just like his first wife. If you believe survivors deserve justice, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss stories that expose the truth. Because this cage, it's about to shatter. The penthouse overlooks Central Park like a throne room surveying its kingdom. Grace Sullivan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her hand resting on her 7-month pregnant belly, watching the city lights shimmer through the autumn rain. Behind her, the Baccarat chandelier cast diamonds across marble floors. Hermès pillows lined the custom Italian sofa. Everything in this $40 million prison was perfect. Everything except her marriage. Grace pressed her palm against the cold glass. 3 years ago, marrying Dominic Harwell felt like winning the lottery. He was 35, brilliant, devastatingly handsome, and owned half of Manhattan's commercial real estate. She was 26, fresh from her master's program, working at a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors. Ironic, considering where she'd end up. Their wedding made page 6. The honeymoon in Santorini lasted 3 weeks. The first time he grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise came 6 months later, when she suggested having dinner with her college friends. "You don't need them anymore," Dominic had said, his blue eyes turning cold. "You have me." Now, standing in this golden cage, Grace felt the baby kick. Her son, the only pure thing in this nightmare. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her robe pocket, expecting another message from Dominic monitoring her location. Instead, an unknown number flashed across the screen. The text read, "Your husband isn't who you think he is. Check his office safe. Code 0614. Your wedding date reversed." Grace's breath caught. She deleted the message immediately, her hands shaking. Dominic monitored everything. Her phone, her emails, the security cameras embedded in every room. He called it protection. She called it surveillance. But tonight, Dominic was at a business dinner in Tribeca. His calendar said he wouldn't return until 11. She glanced at the Cartier watch on her wrist. Another beautiful shackle. 9:15. Grace moved through the penthouse, her footsteps silent on the heated floors. Dominic's home office sat at the far end, all dark wood and leather, smelling of his Tom Ford cologne and old money. She rarely entered this room. He preferred it that way. The safe sat behind a Basquiat original, the painting alone worth $2 million. Grace lifted it carefully, revealing the digital keypad. Her fingers trembled as she entered the number 0. 6, 1, 4, June 14th, their wedding anniversary. Reversed. The safe clicked open while, inside, Grace found 3 passports, each with Dominic's photograph but different names. David Harrison, Richard Caldwell, Marcus Winters. She lifted them with numb fingers, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Beneath the passports, $200,000 in cash sat rubber-banded in neat stacks. And underneath that, a burner phone. Grace powered it on. The screen showed a single contact saved under the letter R. She scrolled through the messages, each one making her blood run colder. "The pregnancy complicates things. We need to accelerate the timeline. She suspects nothing. Trust me. After the baby comes, we'll handle it. Just like before." Just like before. Grace's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the desk, breathing through her nose, fighting the nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Just like before implied there had been someone before her. Another woman, another situation that needed handling. She thought of the framed photograph in Dominic's dresser drawer, the one he kept face down, a beautiful blonde woman on a beach, laughing. When Grace had asked about her once, Dominic's face had gone blank. "My late wife. She drowned. I don't discuss it." Grace had respected that grief. Now she wondered if respect had been her first mistake. She photographed everything with shaking hands. The passports, the cash, the text messages. Then she carefully returned each item, closed the safe, rehung the painting. She walked back to the living room on autopilot, her mind screaming. Her phone buzzed again. Dominic's name flashed across the screen. Her heart lurched. Leaving dinner early. Be home in 20 minutes. Hope you're resting, darling. Grace looked down at her phone, at the photos she'd just taken. Evidence of something dark and dangerous. Evidence that could get her killed. She opened her contacts and called the only person she trusted. Her younger brother Owen answered on the second ring. Grace, it's almost 10. You okay? Owen, I need your help. Her voice cracked. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong with Dominic. What do you mean? I can't explain over the phone. Can you dig into his background? His first wife. How she really died. Silence. Then Owen's voice, low and serious. Grace, what did you find? Just, please, I'll send you what I have. But Owen, be careful. If he finds out. Headlights swept across the windows. The private elevator was ascending. He's home. I have to go. Grace, wait. She ended the call and deleted it from her history. 30 seconds later, the elevator doors opened. Dominic stepped out, impeccable in his Tom Ford suit, holding a bouquet of white roses. Her favorite. He smiled. Hello, beautiful. How's my boy? Grace forced herself to return the smile. Kicking up a storm. Dominic crossed to her, pressed a kiss to her forehead, then knelt to kiss her belly. The gesture would have been tender if Grace hadn't just discovered he was living under false identities with $200,000 in cash and a burner phone coordinating with someone named R about handling her after the baby arrived. I brought your favorite flowers, he said, standing. His hand found the small of her back, possessive and firm. You look pale. Have you been resting? Just tired. His eyes studied her face, searching. Dominic always knew when she was lying. It was like he could read her thoughts, anticipate her moves. That ability had felt romantic once. Now it felt predatory. Did anyone call while I was gone? No, it's been quiet. He nodded slowly. Good. I worry about you here alone. His hand moved to her throat, ostensibly adjusting her necklace, but his fingers lingered on her pulse point. Your heart's racing. The baby, Grace whispered. He's been active tonight. Dominic smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You'd tell me if something was wrong, darling, wouldn't you? This was the moment. The moment Grace Sullivan realized she wasn't imagining the danger. The moment she understood that the man she'd married, the man whose child she carried, was someone else entirely. Someone capable of making people disappear. Of course, she said. I'd tell you everything. Dominic kissed her cheek. That's my girl. He moved toward his office. I need to make a few calls. Don't wait up. Grace watched him go, watched the office door close behind him. She waited 5 minutes, then walked to the bedroom. Her hands shook as she transferred the photos from her phone to a hidden cloud folder she'd created months ago. The one Dominic didn't know about. The one she'd been using to document the bruises, the controlling behavior, the moments when his mask slipped. She'd been gathering evidence for months, knowing that one day she might need to escape. She just hadn't known how urgent that day would be. Outside, the rain fell harder. Thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline. And in his office, Dominic Harwell stood at the window with the burner phone pressed to his ear. It's me, he said quietly. We have a problem. Owen Sullivan hadn't slept. He sat in his cramped East Village apartment, surrounded by monitors and cold coffee, following digital breadcrumbs down a rabbit hole that seemed to have no bottom. Grace's panicked call had activated every protective instinct he possessed. She was the strong one, the caretaker who'd raised him after their parents died. For her to sound that terrified meant something was catastrophically wrong. The photos she'd texted after midnight were damning. 3 passports with 3 names. Owen had connections from investigative journalism, people who could run background checks. What he'd discovered made his blood run cold. Dominic Harwell's first wife, Elizabeth Morrison Foyle, had died 5 years ago in the Hamptons. Official cause, accidental drowning. She'd been 4 months pregnant. The autopsy showed elevated sleep medication, but the medical examiner ruled it accidental. Case closed. But Owen found something the police hadn't. Elizabeth's doctor had lost his medical license 2 years later for fraud. then moved to the Cayman Islands into a $3 million beachfront property on a disgraced doctor's salary. That didn't add up. Owen dug deeper. Harwell Properties was buried under shell corporations. Money trails led through the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, classic money laundering. Then Owen found the pattern. Every 2 years, Dominic moved major assets into his wife's name before tax season, then moved them back. Insurance policies worth tens of millions. It was a shell game, and Grace was the current shell. Owen's phone rang. Unknown number. Owen Sullivan. A woman's voice. Urgent. Who is this? Detective Sarah Booth. NYPD homicide. I need to talk to you about Dominic Harwell. Owen sat up straight. How did you get my number? I've been investigating Harwell for 3 years. This morning, your background checks pinged our system. Your sister's married to him. What does she know? Everything. Last night she found passports, cash, a burner phone with texts about handling her after the baby comes. Silence. Then, in 5 years, 3 women associated with Dominic Harwell died under suspicious circumstances. Elizabeth was first. All had life insurance policies listing Harwell as beneficiary. Owen felt sick. He's going to kill my sister. Not if we stop him, but I need evidence for court. What did Grace find? Owen sent the photos. How long do we have? Not long, but Owen, if Harwell suspects she knows, he'll accelerate. Does he have reason to think she's suspicious? Owen's heart sank. Grace's voice last night. If he finds out, Owen, you still there? I have to get her out. Wait, if you spook him, he'll act immediately. We need to be smart. Then what do we do? Give me 24 hours. I'm going to the DA today with this. We'll get warrants. Tell Grace to act normal. Don't let him suspect anything. And if he hurts her before then, silence. Then I'll have patrol cars nearby. And Owen, my personal cell. Anything happens, call immediately. After hanging up, Owen texted Grace, don't do anything. Help is coming. Act normal. I love you. 5 minutes. 10. No response. Toya. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Grace stood in the bathroom staring at her phone. Owen's text glowed on screen. Act normal. But nothing was normal. Dominic had made her breakfast himself. French toast with strawberries. He'd watched her eat with those cold eyes, making small talk about baby names. Then she'd noticed the bitter aftertaste in her orange juice. Now, 2 hours later, she felt foggy. She'd tried calling Owen back. No service. Impossible on the 52nd floor. Grace moved to the elevator. Pressed the button. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Every door into the penthouse was locked from the outside. She ran to the windows, grabbed a Lalique vase and hurled it. The crystal shattered. The window didn't crack. Bulletproof glass. No, yeah. Grace pulled out her phone, tried 911. The call wouldn't connect. A soft chime. The intercom. Dominic's voice filled the space. Grace, darling, stay calm. This is for your own good. You need rest. The doctor said so. What doctor let me out? Dr. Cross is concerned about your blood pressure. You need complete bed rest until delivery. Dr. Cross, the woman Grace had confided in yesterday, who'd promised to help. You got to her. I protected you from making a terrible mistake. Did you really think I didn't know I've known everything? Grace, every photo, every file you've hidden, every secret. Grace sank to the floor. The cloud folder, deleted an hour ago, along with your contacts, your email backups. You have nothing. No evidence. No allies. No escape. Owen knows. He'll come for me. Dominic laughed softly. Owen embezzled $42,000 3 years ago. I've had those records for months. If he tries to help you, he goes to prison for a decade. Grace couldn't breathe. Owen's secret. Dominic had known all along. Why? Because you're mine, Grace. You and that baby. Everything I build, I keep. And make no mistake, I've built an empire. You killed your first wife. Silence. Then, Elizabeth made poor choices. She tried to leave. She threatened to expose certain arrangements. I gave her every opportunity to reconsider. And after the baby comes, that depends on you. If you cooperate, we'll be a family. If you continue this rebellion, Well, postpartum psychosis is tragically common. The threat was clear. Cooperate or die. I've left water and food in the kitchen. Please eat. You need strength. I'll check on you tonight. The intercom clicked off. Grace sat alone, feeling the baby kick. She thought of Elizabeth, drowned in the Hamptons. She thought of her father, who taught her to pick locks when she was 10. Every door has a key. Gracie, you just have to know where to look. Grace stood, cradling her belly. Your mom's not giving up. Not now, not ever. She walked to the kitchen. On the counter sat water and salad. Grace picked up the water bottle, examined it. The seal was broken. She poured it down the sink. Then she began searching the apartment, looking for the one thing Dominic had overlooked. Because everyone overlooks something. She just had to find it before time ran out. Grace found the crack in Dominic's empire in the laundry room. It took her 4 hours of methodical searching, fighting through the fog in her head from whatever he drugged her with that morning. She checked every drawer, every closet, every forgotten corner of the 12,000 square foot penthouse. The laundry room was the last place she looked, tucked behind the kitchen, a space she rarely entered because their housekeeper handled everything. Behind the industrial dryer, wedged between the wall and the machine, Grace found her old Apple Watch, the one she'd thought she'd lost 3 months ago, the one Dominic had probably hidden, assuming she'd forget about it. Grace pressed the button. The battery was at 18%. Most importantly, it had its own cellular connection, separate from the penthouse Wi-Fi that Dominic had shut down. Her hands shook as she powered it on and sent an SOS to Owen with her location beacon activated. Then she opened the voice memo app and started recording. My name is Grace Sullivan. Today is October 15th. My husband, Dominic Harwell, has locked me inside our penthouse and admitted to killing his first wife, Elizabeth. He's planning to kill me after our baby is born. If you're hearing this, I might already be dead, but he can't get away with it. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The evidence is in his office safe. Passports under false names, cash, a burner phone with messages of someone named R. He has shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He bribed my doctor, Ellen Cross. He's blackmailing my brother. He controls everything. Grace looked around the laundry room, at the designer washer and dryer that cost more than most people's cars. To anyone who loved me, I'm sorry. To my son, I fought for you with everything I had. And Dominic, if you're watching this, know that you didn't break me. You never broke me. She uploaded the video to the cloud account under a fake name, using her college roommate's birthday as the password. Then she tucked the watch under the dryer again. Hidden but accessible. The baby kicked hard, and Grace gasped. The movement felt different, urgent. She was heading back to the bedroom when she heard voices from Dominic's office. He must have returned while she was searching. Grace moved silently across the marble floors, pressing herself against the wall near his door. It was cracked open just an inch. Can't wait 2 more months. A woman's voice, sharp and impatient. Every day she's alive is a risk. Grace's blood went cold. She knew that voice. She'd heard it at a dozen charity events, always honeyed and sweet. Rachel, we discussed this. Dominic sounded tired. The baby needs to be full term. If we move now, it looks suspicious. The autopsy won't matter if we do it right. I've researched this. Pregnancy complications happen all the time. An embolism, an aneurysm. Quick, tragic, and impossible to prove otherwise. Rachel Brennan, the event planner Dominic hired for every corporate function. Beautiful, sharp, always watching Grace with those calculating eyes. Besides, Rachel continued, I've been patient for 3 years. You promised me that after Elizabeth, I'd be next. Then you went and married this nonprofit Girl Scout instead. Made me wait while you played house with her. The investors needed someone with her image, Dominic said. Clean, respectable. The widow remarries too soon angle was problematic. Grace was perfect. Young, naive, no family except that brother. Easy to control. Easy to control. Rachel laughed. She's been documenting your abuse for months. Dominic, she found your safe. She contacted the police. That's not controlled. That's catastrophic. Which I've handled. She has no evidence anymore. No allies. No way out. You said that about Elizabeth too. Then she almost got to her lawyer with those financial records. You got lucky that night in the Hamptons. Silence. Then Dominic's voice. Cold. I don't get lucky. I plan. Grace pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting down nausea. They were discussing Elizabeth's murder like a business transaction. And Rachel hadn't been a mistress. She'd been a partner, a co-conspirator. Fine, Rachel said. We wait. But after the baby comes, I want her gone. And this time, I'm the one you marry. No more delays. No more excuses. 3 years. Dominic, I've earned it. You'll get everything I promised. The moment Grace is out of the picture, we'll make it official. You'll be the new Mrs. Harwell. And the baby, he'll be raised properly. By us. Away from his mother's. Unfortunate instability. Yeah. Grace backed away from the door, her vision blurring with tears. They were going to kill her and take her son. Raise him to believe his mother had been crazy. Dangerous. Someone who needed to be eliminated for everyone's safety. She made it to the bedroom before her legs gave out. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Grace tried to think through the panic. She needed a plan. She needed the bedroom door opened. Rachel Brennan stood in the doorway, holding a syringe. Hello, Grace? Grace scrambled backward on the bed. Don't touch me, Rachel smiled. The expression transformed her face from beautiful to predatory. Dominic asked me to check on you. He's worried about your blood pressure. This will help you rest. Stay away from me. Fighting will only make it worse for you and the baby. Rachel stepped closer. You know, I actually admire you. You lasted longer than Elizabeth. She broke after 6 months, but you're stubborn. Almost made me believe Dominic had finally met someone who could handle him. Grace's hand found the bedside lamp. I'm not Elizabeth. No, you're smarter, which makes you more dangerous. Rachel lunged forward with the syringe. Grace swung the lamp. It connected with Rachel's shoulder, sending her sprawling. The syringe skittered across the floor. Grace didn't think. She just ran. Through the bedroom door, down the hallway, toward the kitchen. Behind her, Rachel screamed, Dominic, she's loose. Grace grabbed a knife from the butcher block. 8 inches of German steel, the kind that cost $300, the kind that could save her life. Dominic appeared at the end of the hallway, blocking her path to the elevator. His face was calm, almost sad. Grace, put down the knife. Let me out. You know I can't do that. I'll kill you. I swear to God, He moved fast, faster than she expected. One moment he was 10 feet away. The next his hand was on her wrist, twisting. The knife clattered to the floor. Grace screamed and drove her knee into his stomach. Dominic grunted, his grip loosening. Grace shoved him hard, surprising him with her strength. Adrenaline and terror made her move like lightning. She snatched the knife back up and ran for the elevator. The panel was dead, but there was a manual release. Her father had taught her about building codes, about emergency exits. Every elevator had one. She just had to find it. Her fingers found the edge of the panel, pried it open. Behind it, a red lever. She yanked it down. The elevator doors opened. Grace, stop. Dominic was running toward her, Rachel behind him. Grace stepped into the elevator and slammed the emergency stop button. The doors closed just as Dominic reached them. She heard him pounding on the other side, heard the fury in his voice, but she was moving. Down. Away. The elevator opened onto the lobby. 3 in the morning, the night security guard looked up from his desk, startled. Mrs. Harwell, are you? Grace burst past him, still holding the knife, wearing nothing but her silk pajamas and bare feet. She hit the street running. Manhattan at 3 a.m. was a different world. Empty storefronts, scattered pedestrians, the occasional taxi. Grace ran down Fifth Avenue, her breath coming in gasps, the baby pressing heavy against her lungs. Behind her, she heard shouting. Security guards pouring out of the building. She turned onto a side street, ducked into an alley. Her feet were bleeding, her lungs burned, but she was free. For the first time in months. She was blue and red lights flashed at the end of the alley. A police car. Grace almost sobbed with relief. She ran toward it, waving her arms. Help, please. Help me. 2 officers emerged. One of them, an older man with gray hair, smiled gently. Mrs. Harwell, we got a call. Your husband is very worried. Grace's blood turned to ice. No, no, you don't understand. He's trying to kill me. He killed his first wife. I have evidence. Ma'am, but you need to calm down. The second officer, younger, moved to her side. You're having a psychiatric episode. Dr. Cross called us. She's very concerned about you. I'm not crazy. He drugged me. He locked me in. The older officer pulled out papers. This is an emergency psychiatric hold, signed by your physician. We need to take you to the hospital for evaluation. No, Grace backed away, but the alley was a dead end. Call Detective Sarah Booth. She knows. She's investigating him. Please, just call her. The officers exchanged glances. The younger one spoke into his radio, but Grace couldn't hear what he was saying. She only saw him nod, saw the older officer pull out handcuffs. Mrs. Harwell, for your safety and the baby's safety, we need you to come with us. I'm not going anywhere with you. Grace raised the knife she'd forgotten she was holding. Both officers drew their weapons. Drop the knife, ma'am. Now. Grace looked at the guns pointed at her, at the police who were supposed to protect her but were clearly on Dominic's payroll, at the empty street beyond the alley where no help was coming. She dropped the knife. They cuffed her gently, reading her rights in soft, patient voices, the way you'd talk to someone dangerously unstable. The older officer called for an ambulance. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. Grace begged. She pleaded. She told them everything. About Elizabeth, about the offshore accounts, about Rachel's syringe. They nodded sympathetically and gave her a sedative. As her vision blurred, Grace saw Dominic's Mercedes pull up at the end of the alley. He stepped out, perfect in his tailored suit despite the hour, concern etched across his handsome face, playing the worried husband perfectly. He approached the ambulance, spoke with the officers. One of them clapped him on the shoulder sympathetically. Poor man, dealing with a mentally ill wife. The last thing Grace saw before the sedative pulled her under was Dominic's face in the ambulance window. He mouthed 3 words, "I told you." Then darkness swallowed everything. Grace woke to white walls and the smell of disinfectant. Her wrists were strapped to the bed rails with soft restraints. An eye dripped clear fluid into her arm. Institutional fluorescent lights hummed overhead. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came rushing back. The escape, the police, the sedative. You're awake. A nurse appeared, kind-faced and efficient. How are you feeling, Mrs. Harwell? Where am I, my thoughts? Riverside Psychiatric Center. You were brought in early this morning for evaluation. You've been asleep for 16 hours. 16 hours. Grace's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The baby kicked weakly. Is he okay? Dr. Cross examined you. The baby's fine, but your blood pressure is dangerously high. We need to monitor you closely. The nurse checked the IV. You have visitors. Your husband is here, and a Ms. Brennan. Should I send them in? No. Grace pulled against the restraints. They're trying to kill me. They admitted it. Please, you have to believe me. The nurse's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. Mrs. Harwell, your husband explained everything in the paranoia, the delusions. It's more common than you think, especially in high-risk pregnancies. We're going to help you. I'm not delusional. Check my Apple Watch. I recorded everything. It's hidden in the laundry room at the penthouse. Behind the dryer. Please, just look. But the nurse was already adjusting something in the IV. This will help you rest. Dr. Cross will be by this afternoon to discuss your treatment plan. No, wait. The medication hit fast. Grace felt the familiar fog descending, the heavy weight pulling her under. She fought it, trying to stay conscious, trying to remember where she'd hidden the watch, trying to... When she woke again, the light outside the barred window had changed. Evening, maybe. Her mouth was dry, her thoughts sluggish. The door opened. Dominic entered, carrying flowers. White roses. Her favorite. Rachel followed him, dressed in a designer pantsuit, playing the concerned friend perfectly. Grace, sweetheart. Dominic sat beside the bed, taking her restrained hand in his. You scared us. Running out into the street like that. Holding a knife. The police said you were threatening people. Liar, Grace whispered. I know you don't understand right now, The doctors say pregnancy can sometimes trigger psychotic episodes. Your hormone levels are erratic. The stress. Stop, just stop. Grace looked at Rachel. Tell him. Tell him what you said about killing me. Rachel's face was a mask of concern. Grace, honey, I've never said anything like that. I'm your friend. I've been planning your baby shower. You said you'd been waiting 3 years. That Dominic promised you'd be next after Elizabeth. Elizabeth? Rachel looked at Dominic, confused. Who's Elizabeth? My first wife, Dominic said gently. Grace has become obsessed with her. She thinks, well, the delusions are quite complex. Dr. Cross will explain. Grace wanted to scream, but the medication kept her voice weak. I heard you, both of you, in his office. You talked about making it look like an embolism. Grace, I haven't been to Dominic's office in months. I've been in Milan for the Fashion Week charity events. I just flew back yesterday when Dominic called about your episode. Rachel touched Grace's shoulder. We're here for you, whatever you need. They were gaslighting her, both of them, perfectly synchronized, making her doubt her own memory, her own sanity. The door opened again. A woman in her 50s entered, white coat and clipboard. Mr. Harwell, I'm Dr. Patricia Coleman. We spoke on the phone. Grace recognized the name from somewhere. Then she remembered Judge Patricia Coleman had been listed in the pre-approved names. But this was a doctor, different person. This Dr. Coleman must have been the psychiatric evaluator. How is she? Dominic asked. Her blood work shows elevated stress hormones and signs of sleep deprivation. Combined with her history of anxiety and the high-risk pregnancy, I believe we're seeing an acute psychotic episode. I'm recommending inpatient care until the baby is born. No, Grace said. Call Detective Sarah Booth. She'll tell you she's investigating him. Coleman made a note. Paranoid delusions involving law enforcement are common in these cases. Has she mentioned this detective before? Several times, Dominic said. She's convinced there's some conspiracy. I've tried to reassure her, but the delusions are quite entrenched. I have evidence. Grace pulled against the restraints. I recorded everything. It's on my Apple Watch. Please, just check. Cheddar. Coleman looked at Dominic. Does she own an Apple Watch? She lost it months ago. We searched everywhere. This is part of the delusion. I'm afraid. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. They'd thought of everything, every piece of evidence she might use. They'd already discredited. They'd built a narrative where she was the crazy one, the dangerous one, and everyone believed them. I want to keep her for observation, Dr. Mari Coleman said. We'll start with a mild antipsychotic, adjust her prenatal vitamins, and monitor the baby closely. If she stabilizes, we can discuss outpatient care after delivery. Whatever she needs. Dominic said. He squeezed Grace's hand. We're going to get through this, darling, together. After they left, Grace lay in the dim room, listening to the sounds of the facility around her. Someone screaming down the hall, the squeak of medication carts, the buzz of fluorescent lights. She thought about Owen. Had he gotten her SOS? Was he trying to find her, or had Dominic already acted on his threat, sent the embezzlement evidence to prosecutors? She thought about Detective Booth. Would she even know Grace had been institutionalized? Would she care? And she thought about Elizabeth, drowning in the Hamptons, probably sedated just like this, unable to fight, unable to save herself or her baby. Grace looked down at her belly. Her son was still moving, still fighting. I'm sorry, but she whispered. I tried. I really tried. But deep in her chest, beneath the medication and the despair, a small flame of rage still burned. They hadn't broken her. Not yet. And as long as that flame lived, she had one weapon they couldn't take away. Stubbornness. The same trait that had gotten her through her parents' death, through raising Owen alone, through graduate school on scholarships and willpower. Grace closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to plan. Because somewhere in this nightmare, there had to be a crack in their armor. A moment where they'd get careless. A witness they couldn't pay off. A mistake they couldn't cover. She just had to survive long enough to find it. Owen Sullivan stood outside Riverside Psychiatric Center at dawn, holding 2 coffees and fighting the urge to storm the building. He'd been calling Grace's cell for 24 hours straight. Nothing. Then an administrator called his sister had been admitted for psychiatric evaluation. Visitors restricted to immediate family only. Her husband counted, her brother didn't. Detective Booth had warned him not to do anything rash, but watching his sister disappear into Dominic's trap felt like swallowing glass. Owen had spent the night following leads, trying to find anyone who could help. What he'd found was a wall, a perfectly constructed, legally sound wall. The emergency psychiatric hold was signed by Dr. Ellen Cross, citing postpartum psychosis concerns. The police report described a pregnant woman wielding a knife, making delusional accusations. The admitting psychiatrist confirmed the diagnosis with 20 years of experience backing her. On paper, everything looked legitimate. In reality, Owen knew it was murder in slow motion. Detective Booth called. The DA rejected my warrant request, said the evidence is too circumstantial. The passports could be for security. The texts are vague. Without concrete proof of criminal intent, they won't touch him. Owen wanted to put his fist through something. He's got my sister locked in a psych ward. I know, but legally, she's being treated for a mental health crisis. Her own doctor signed off. Unless we prove the diagnosis is false, there's nothing I can do. So we prove it's false. Owen, Dominic has resources we can't match. Money, lawyers, judges in his pocket. We need to be smarter. Rachel Brennan, Grace overheard her talking with Dominic about Elizabeth's murder. If we can flip her, get her to testify, why would she turn on him? Because accessories get lighter sentences than principals. Everyone has a pressure point. We need to find hers. Owen looked up at the facility's windows. What do you need? Everything you can find on Rachel Brennan, employment history, financial records. There's a reason she's been waiting 3 years. Maybe that patience is wearing thin. After the call, Owen opened his laptop. Rachel Brennan's social media showed glamorous perfection, but her financial records told a different story. 3 years ago, she'd been drowning in debt, student loans, credit cards, a bankruptcy filing mysteriously withdrawn. Then she'd started working for Harwell Properties. Her salary was modest, but her lifestyle suggested income far beyond what she earned. Owen found payments to luxury apartments, designer purchases, all paid through Dominic's shell companies. She wasn't just his mistress. She was on his payroll. Owen dug deeper, found an old article from 5 years ago. Event planner questioned in client's death. The client was Elizabeth Harwell. Rachel had organized a charity event the weekend Elizabeth drowned. Then Owen found what the police missed 2 weeks after Elizabeth's death. Rachel purchased a Tribeca condo, cash sale, $1.2 million. For someone filing bankruptcy 6 months earlier, that was impossible. Unless Dominic had paid her. Owen compiled everything and sent it to Detective Booth. Then he made a dangerous decision. He was going to talk to Rachel Brennan himself. Rachel lived in that Tribeca condo. Owen waited in the lobby until a resident left, then slipped through, 4th floor, apartment 412. He knocked, the door opened. Rachel stood there in yoga pants and cashmere, wine glass in hand. She frowned. Can I help you? My name is Owen Sullivan. Grace is my sister. Rachel's expression didn't change. I know who you are. What do you want? To talk. 5 minutes. I have nothing to say. She started closing the door. Owen put his hand on it. He's going to kill her. You know that. The question is whether you're okay with it. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Your sister is mentally ill. She's getting help. You were there when Elizabeth drowned. Did she need help too? Something flickered in Rachel's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. He paid you $1.2 million 2 weeks after Elizabeth died. I have the records. How long until police connect you to her death? Rachel's hand tightened on the door. That was a loan. From a Cayman shell company. That's hush money. Owen leaned closer. How long until you're a loose end he needs to tie up? Rachel went pale. You don't understand. Dominic and I are getting married. After the baby. After the baby, Grace dies and you become wife number 3. How long do you think you'll last? What happens when he needs another tax shelter? I am different and I understand him. You're terrified of him. I'm not. You're standing here arguing with a stranger instead of calling security. You're scared, not of me, of what he'll do if he finds out we talked. Rachel's hands shook, wine sloshing. What do you want? Help me save my sister. Testify about Elizabeth. I can't. Why? Because you think he loves you. Owen showed her the payment records. This isn't love. This is business, and business arrangements end. Rachel stared at the screen. For a moment, Owen thought he'd reached her. Then her expression hardened. You have 10 seconds to leave before I call security. She slammed the door. Owen stood in the hallway, cursing. He'd pushed too hard. Now Rachel would tell Dominic. His phone rang. Detective Booth. Owen, and where are you? Tribeca, I talked to Rachel Brennan. Booth cursed. I told you not to approach her. She's scared. I saw it. If we can protect her, offer immunity. We need her confession first. But Owen, I've been looking at a Riverside. The facility is owned by a medical corporation. Guess who sits on the board? Owen's stomach dropped. Dominic. One of his shell companies. He doesn't just have influence there. He owns it. Grace isn't in a hospital. She's in his prison. We need to get her out. Legally, we can't. She's been committed by the book. Then we go around the book. Owen, I'm not letting him win. Whatever it takes. He ended the call. If legal channels wouldn't work, he'd use the one weapon he had left. The press. Owen had contacts at every major outlet. He'd broken stories that ended careers, exposed fraud, brought down corrupt officials. Time to weaponize that reputation. He started writing. Not an article, but information. Dominic's shell companies, Elizabeth's suspicious death, Rachel's mysterious windfall, the psychiatric facility Dominic owned. He couldn't prove murder. Not yet. But he could create reasonable doubt, make people ask questions. Owen hit send on the first email, then the second, then the third. By noon, his story would be on 10 journalists' desks. By evening, it would be online. By tomorrow, Dominic Harwell's perfect facade would start to crack. And when it did, Owen would be there to push it over completely. The story went viral in 6 hours. Owen's article, published on a prominent investigative journalism site, was picked up by local news, then national outlets. By midnight, Dominic Harwell was trending on Twitter. By morning, news vans surrounded both the psychiatric facility where Grace was held and Harwell Properties headquarters in Midtown. The headline read, "Billionaire real estate mogul devoted husband or dangerous predator." Owen had been careful. He'd stated only facts, raised questions rather than accusations. He'd included statements from Detective Booth about the ongoing investigation into Elizabeth Harwell's death. He'd published the property records showing Rachel Brennan's mysterious wealth and Dominic's ownership of the psychiatric facility. Most damning, he'd found 3 other women, former employees of Harwell Properties who'd signed NDAs but were willing to speak anonymously about Dominic's controlling behavior, his volatile temper, his pattern of isolating and manipulating women. The story painted a picture without explicitly saying the words. Let the readers draw their own conclusions. And they did. Loudly. Within 24 hours, protesters gathered outside Riverside Psychiatric Center demanding Grace's release. Women's advocacy groups issued statements. Legal experts appeared on cable news debating psychiatric commitment laws and coercive control. Dominic tried damage control. His lawyers released a statement expressing sadness that private medical issues were being sensationalized, emphasizing Grace's need for treatment and privacy. But it was too little, too late. The court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. Inside the facility, Grace knew something had changed when Dr. Coleman appeared with a different expression. Not kind, worried. Mrs. Harwell, there's been a situation, media attention regarding your case. Your husband is dealing with protesters outside. For your safety, we're moving you to a more secure wing. Grace's heart leaped. Media attention meant Owen had done something. I want to talk to the press. That's not possible. You're under psychiatric hold. I have a right to legal representation. I want a lawyer, one I choose, not one my husband provides. Dr. Coleman hesitated. Grace saw the crack in her armor. Whatever Owen had done, it had made the facility nervous, made them worry about liability, about lawsuits, about their reputation. I'll discuss it with the administrators. That afternoon, a lawyer arrived. Not one of Dominic's people, A woman in her 50s named Margaret Foster from the ACLU. Mrs. Harwell, I'm here on behalf of women's advocacy groups who've raised concerns about your commitment. I need to ask you some questions. Are you aware of why you're here? Grace sat up straight on her, mind sharp despite the medication fog. This was her chance. Maybe her only chance. I'm here because my husband wants to kill me, and the system is helping him do it. For the next hour, Grace told her everything. The bruises she'd documented, the controlling behavior, finding the passports and burner phone, overhearing Dominic and Rachel discussing her murder, her attempted escape, the police who took her to the facility instead of protecting her. Margaret took notes, her expression growing darker. Do you have evidence of any of this? I recorded a video on my Apple Watch. It's hidden in our penthouse, in the laundry room behind the dryer. Everything I'm telling you is on that recording. Your husband claims you lost that watch months ago. He hid it. He thought I'd forget about it. But it's there, and it's still logged into my iCloud account. If you can get a warrant to search the apartment, that's unlikely, but if the watch is connected to your iCloud, we might be able to access it remotely, with your permission. Grace felt hope surge. Yes, whatever you need. Margaret pulled out a tablet. Give me your Apple ID and password. Grace recited them, her hands trembling. Margaret worked silently, navigating through accounts and permissions. Minutes felt like hours. Then Margaret's eyes widened. There's a device logged in. Apple Watch Series 6. Last location pings was your address. 2 days ago. That's it? That's when I hit it and recorded the video. Margaret accessed the iCloud backup, found the voice memo, pressed play. Grace's voice filled the room. My name is Grace Sullivan. Today is October 15th. My husband, Dominic Harwell, has locked me inside our penthouse and admitted to killing his first wife, Elizabeth. Margaret listened to the entire recording. When it finished, she looked at Grace with an expression that was part horror, part determination. Mrs. Harwell, this changes everything. Within 2 hours, Margaret had contacted Detective Booth. Within 4 hours, they'd obtained an emergency order from a different judge, one not connected to Dominic's network. Within 6 hours, police were executing a search warrant at the penthouse. They found the Apple Watch exactly where Grace said it would be. By evening, Dominic Harwell was in custody. Rachel Brennan was brought in for questioning. Dr. Ellen Cross's medical license was suspended pending investigation. Owen arrived at the facility just as Grace was being released. When the doors opened and he saw his sister, alive and walking out on her own, he nearly collapsed with relief. Grace, she hugged him so hard they both shook. You did it. You saved me. You saved yourself. I just made some noise. Detective Booth approached, professional but with a hint of warmth. Mrs. Harwell, I'm sorry we didn't move faster. We're going to do everything we can to make this right. Grace nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. That night, safe in Owen's apartment with 2 police officers stationed outside, Grace watched the news coverage. Dominic's arrest was the top story on every channel. His lawyers were already spinning, but the evidence was damning. The recording, the search of his office revealing the passports, the ground, the burner phone, financial records showing payments to Rachel. Most crucially, Rachel had broken. Faced with murder conspiracy charges, she'd taken a deal. Full immunity in exchange for testimony about Elizabeth's death and the plan to kill Grace. Rachel confessed that she and Dominic had been having an affair for 6 years. She'd helped him drug Elizabeth the night she drowned, making it look like an accident. She'd expected Dominic to marry her afterward, but he'd married Grace instead, telling Rachel it was for business purposes, that Grace was temporary. I believed him, Rachel said in the recorded interview, her face haggard. I thought after this baby came, he'd keep his promise. But watching him with Grace, I realized he'd never meant it. I was just another tool he used. We all were. Grace turned off the television. She couldn't watch anymore. Couldn't think about how close she'd come to ending up like Elizabeth. Owen brought her tea. How are you feeling? Numb, grateful, terrified. She looked down at her belly. What kind of world am I bringing him into? One where his mother fought like hell to protect him, where she didn't give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. Owen sat beside her. You're the strongest person I know. Grace, She leaned against his shoulder. I just want this to be over. Soon, the DA says they have enough to charge Dominic with conspiracy to commit murder for both you and Elizabeth. Rachel's testimony, your recording, the financial evidence. He's going away for life. And the baby to is yours, completely, legally yours. Dominic signed away parental rights as part of his plea negotiation. He doesn't want a trial. Grace closed her eyes. It was over, really over. Dominic would spend the rest of his life in prison. She was freed, but freedom felt strange after so long in a cage. Like a limb that had fallen asleep, the sensation of safety was almost painful. I need to testify, Grace said. At his sentencing, I need to face him. Owen hesitated. You don't have to. Yes, I do. For Elizabeth, for every woman he manipulated and destroyed, he needs to hear that he didn't win. Then I'll be right there with you. Grace nodded. In 6 months, she'd stand in a courtroom and tell her story. She'd look Dominic Harwell in the eye and take back everything he'd stolen from her home. But tonight, she just sat with her brother in a tiny apartment that smelled like coffee and old books, feeling her son kick inside her, and let herself believe that maybe, somehow, everything would be okay. 6 months later, Grace stood outside the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse, holding her 3-month-old son. She'd named him James after her father. He had her eyes and her brother's stubborn chin and absolutely nothing of Dominic except chromosomes that didn't matter. The media circus had died down somewhat, but there were still cameras, still reporters shouting questions. Grace had learned to ignore them. She'd learned to ignore a lot of things during her recovery. The PTSD, the nightmares, the panic attacks that came when doors closed or lights went out. She was in therapy twice a week. Some days were better than others. Today was a better day. Today was the day Dominic would be sentenced. Owen met her at the courthouse steps. Ready? No, but let's do it anyway. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Grace recognized faces from the news coverage advocates for domestic violence survivors, journalists, legal experts. Elizabeth's family was there too, her sister and elderly parents, all three of them looking at Grace with a mixture of grief and gratitude. Grace had met with them 2 months ago. They'd cried together, mourned together, shared stories about the women Elizabeth and Grace had been before Dominic Harwell destroyed their lives. She would have liked you, Elizabeth's sister had said. She was kind like you, strong like you. Now, sitting in the courtroom holding James, Grace felt that connection like a thread between past and present. She was here for both of them. The bailiff called the room to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Blackwell. The judge entered, a stern-faced man in his 60s who'd handled some of the city's highest-profile cases. He took his seat. Please be seated. We're here for the sentencing of Dominic James Harwell. Will the defendant rise? Dominic stood. 6 months in jail had changed him. His hair was shorter, graying at the temples. He'd lost weight. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by prison orange, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating. He looked directly at Grace. She didn't look away. Judge Blackwell reviewed the file. Mr. Harwell, you've been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Elizabeth Harwell, conspiracy to commit murder against Grace Sullivan, kidnapping, witness tampering, and multiple counts of fraud. Before I pass sentence, I'm going to hear victim impact statements. Ms. Sullivan, you may approach. Grace handed James to Owen and walked to the podium. Her hands shook as she unfolded her prepared statement. Then she set it aside. She didn't need notes for this. 6 years ago, Elizabeth Morrison married a man she thought would protect her. Instead, he murdered her and their unborn child. 3 years ago, I made the same mistake. I married a man who seemed perfect, who promised to love and cherish me. What I got was a prison made of marble and lies. Grace's voice strengthened. Dominic Harwell is a predator who uses wealth and charm to trap women. He controls every aspect of their lives. He isolates them from family and friends. He makes them doubt their own sanity. And when they try to leave, when they threaten his carefully constructed image, he eliminates them. She looked at Dominic. He stared back, expressionless. I almost became his second victim. I would have, if not for my brother's courage and Detective Booth's persistence, But I'm standing here today to tell you that I survived. My son survived, and Dominic's power over me is gone. Grace's voice cracked. He tried to erase me, to make me disappear the way he made Elizabeth disappear. But I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure other women don't fall into the same trap. She paused, gathering herself. Your Honor, I don't believe in revenge, but I believe in justice. I believe that men like Dominic Harwell need to face consequences for their actions, not just for what they did, but for what they would have continued to do if they hadn't been stopped. He's asked this court for leniency, for consideration of his philanthropic work, his contributions to the community. But charity doesn't erase murder. Good deeds don't balance out destroying lives. He made choices, calculated, deliberate choices, and he needs to live with those choices for the rest of his life. Grace folded her paper. My son will grow up knowing his mother is a survivor, not a victim. He'll know that speaking truth to power matters, that fighting back matters, that women's lives matter. She looked at the judge. Thank you for listening. The courtroom was silent as Grace returned to her seat. James had fallen asleep in Owen's arms, peaceful and unaware of the gravity of the moment. Judge Blackwell called Elizabeth's sister next. Her testimony was brief but devastating. She spoke of the vibrant woman Elizabeth had been, the dreams she'd had, the life that had been stolen from her. My sister called me the day before she died, Elizabeth's sister said, tears streaming down her face. She said she was scared, that Dominic was acting strange. I told her she was imagining things, that he loved her. I was wrong, and I'll carry that guilt forever. After she sat down, the judge addressed the court. I've presided over many cases in my career. I've seen the worst of human nature, but rarely have I seen such calculated cruelty, such complete disregard for human life. He looked at Dominic. Mr. Harwell, you had every advantage: wealth, education, opportunity. You chose to use those advantages to prey on vulnerable women. You orchestrated the murder of your first wife and unborn child. You attempted to do the same to Grace Sullivan and her son. You corrupted medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and psychiatric evaluators. You turned institutions meant to protect people into weapons. Your lawyers have argued for leniency based on your lack of prior criminal record and your philanthropic work, but I find no mitigating factors here. Your crimes were not crimes of passion or desperation. They were carefully planned acts of evil. Judge Blackwell's voice hardened. For the conspiracy to murder Elizabeth Harwell and her unborn child, I sentence you to 25 years to life. For the conspiracy to murder Grace Sullivan and her unborn child, I sentence you to 25 years to life, to run consecutively. For kidnapping, witness tampering, and fraud, an additional 15 years. He slammed the gavel. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will never again have the opportunity to harm another woman. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed out to file stories. Supporters hugged Grace. Elizabeth's family cried with relief. Grace just stood there, holding her son, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. It was over. Really, truly over. Dominic was being led away in handcuffs when he turned back one last time. You'll regret this, he called out. You'll never escape what I did to you. Never. Grace met his eyes. You're wrong. I already have. The guards pulled him away. Grace watched until he disappeared through the door, then turned to Owen. Let's go home. Outside, the autumn sun was warm on her face. Grace stood on the courthouse steps, dozens of microphones thrust toward her, cameras flashing. She'd prepared a statement with her lawyer, something brief and professional. But looking at all those faces, at the women in the crowd who'd come to support her, Grace decided to speak from the heart instead. To everyone who supported me through this nightmare, thank you. To Detective Sarah Booth, who never gave up even when the system failed, thank you. To my brother Owen, who risked everything to save me, I love you. She adjusted James in her arms. And to any woman watching this who's trapped in an abusive relationship, who thinks there's no way out, I want you to know you're stronger than you think. Your life matters. Your voice matters. And there are people who will fight for you. Grace paused. I lost everything during this ordeal. My home, my sense of safety, my ability to trust. But I gained something too. I learned that I'm a survivor, that I can face the worst moments of my life and come out the other side. And if I can do it, so can you. She looked directly into the cameras. Dominic Harwell thought he could erase me, but I'm still here, and I always will be. Grace turned and walked down the steps, her brother beside her, her son in her arms, and her head held high. The nightmare was over. The healing was just beginning. Spring came to New York with the gentle insistence of hope. Grace sat in her modest apartment in Brooklyn, watching James play on a blanket spread across the floor. At 9 months old, he was trying to crawl, his determination both hilarious and heartbreaking. Every milestone felt like a victory, a reminder that they'd both survived. The apartment was nothing like the penthouse. It was a 2-bedroom walk-up in Park Slope, with creaky floors and a radiator that clanged at odd hours. But it was hers, truly hers, rented with money from the book advance she'd received for her memoir. The Gilded Cage. Writing it had been therapeutic and agonizing in equal measure, reliving every moment of abuse, every manipulation, every terror-filled night. But it had also been necessary, a way to reclaim her narrative, to turn her pain into something that might help others. The book had been published 2 months ago and immediately hit the bestseller list. Grace donated half the proceeds to domestic violence shelters. The other half went into a trust for James. She'd also started speaking publicly, at women's shelters, college campuses, legal conferences, talking about coercive control, about how abuse doesn't always leave visible bruises, about the importance of believing survivors. It was exhausting work. Every speech required her to relive trauma, to expose wounds that hadn't fully healed. But the messages she received afterward made it worthwhile. You gave me the courage to leave. I didn't know what I was experiencing had a name until I heard you speak. My daughter is alive because your story helped me see the warning signs. Those messages kept Grace going on the hard days. And there were still hard days. The PTSD hadn't disappeared. She still had nightmares where Dominic was chasing her through endless hallways. She still panicked in elevators, remembering that final escape. She still checked locks 3 times before bed, still kept her phone charged and within reach, still felt her heart race when someone stood too close. But she was healing, slowly with therapy and time and the support of people who loved her. Owen visited every Sunday. He'd left investigative journalism to write a book of his own about Dominic's crimes and the systemic failures that had enabled them. It was due out in the fall. A detective, Sarah Booth, had been promoted to lieutenant. She'd used the publicity from the Harwell case to push for new protocols in domestic violence investigations, for better training on coercive control, for mandatory body cameras when executing psychiatric holds. Change is slow, she told Grace over coffee last month, but it's happening. Because of you. Grace didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who'd survived something she shouldn't have had to survive in the first place. But if her survival could create change, she'd accept that burden. A knock on the door pulled Grace from her thoughts. She checked the peephole, a habit she'd never break. Margaret Foster, her lawyer, stood in the hallway holding a briefcase. Grace opened the door. Margaret, I wasn't expecting you. Sorry for dropping by unannounced, but I have news I wanted to deliver in person. Margaret entered, set her briefcase on the table. Rachel Brennan contacted me. Grace's stomach tightened. She hadn't thought about Rachel in months. After testifying against Dominic, Rachel had entered witness protection. Grace had been glad to never see her again. Why, she wants to meet with you. She says she has information about Dominic's other victims. Women who signed NDAs, who took settlements to stay quiet. Rachel kept records, names, dates, settlement amounts. She wants to help you expose them. Grace picked up James, holding him close. Why would she do that? Guilt, maybe? Or maybe she's genuinely trying to make amends. Either way, the information could be valuable. We could potentially void those NDAs on public interest grounds. Give those women a chance to speak. I don't want to see her. Margaret nodded. I understand. You don't have to. I can meet with her, get the information directly. Grace walked to the window, watching people move through the spring sunshine below. Normal people living normal lives. She wanted that so badly. Wanted to just be a mother, a writer, a woman who'd survived and moved on. But Margaret was right. If Rachel's information could help other women, could prevent future Dominics from destroying future Graces, didn't she have an obligation to at least look at it? Give me a week, Grace said. Need to think about it. After Margaret left, Grace sat on the floor with James. He'd abandoned crawling attempts in favor of chewing on a soft block, content in his simple baby world. What do you think, little man? Grace asked. Should mommy be brave one more time? James babbled something that might have been agreement or might have been nothing. Either way, Grace found herself smiling. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Grace's first instinct was to ignore it, but something made her answer. Grace Sullivan. Yes. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I was Dominic's paralegal 4 years ago. I saw you on the news. Read your book. I need to talk to someone who'll understand. Grace's heart ached. Another victim. Another woman Dominic had hurt. I'm listening. For the next hour, Jennifer told her story. The small controlling behaviors that escalated. The sexual harassment disguised as mentoring. The night Dominic had cornered her in the office. The night she'd fought back and won, but lost her job and her reputation in the process. He paid me $50,000 to sign an NDA and disappear. Jennifer said, I thought it was over. But then I got married last year, and my husband, he started acting like Dominic. The same controlling behaviors. The same manipulation. I realized Dominic had taught me that this was normal. That this was what love looked like. It's not, Grace said gently. That's not love. I know. I left my husband. I'm in therapy. But Grace, there are more of us. So many more. And we're all carrying this alone because we can't talk about it. Because of the NDAs. Because of shame. Because who'd believe us against someone like Dominic Harwell? I believe you. Jennifer's voice broke. Thank you, God. Thank you. After the call ended, Grace sat in the gathering dusk, still holding her phone. She thought about Margaret's offer, about Rachel's information, about Jennifer and all the other women still trapped in silence. She looked at James, sleeping now in his baby swing. She'd survived for him. She'd fought for him. She'd rebuilt her life so he'd grow up with a mother who was whole and strong and free. But maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe she needed to fight for all the Jennifers too. For all the women who'd believed they were alone, who'd been paid to stay quiet, who'd been taught that their pain didn't matter. Grace called Margaret back. Set up the meeting with Rachel. I'll do it. Are you sure? No, but I'm doing it anyway. Because that's what survivors did. They kept fighting even when they were tired. They kept speaking even when their voices shook. They kept showing up for each other because the world wouldn't change unless someone forced it to. Grace had been forced into survival. Now she was choosing something more. She was choosing to thrive. The coffee shop Rachel had chosen was deliberately public and neutral, a crowded Starbucks in Midtown where they could blend into the afternoon rush. Grace arrived early with Margaret, claiming a corner table with a view of the door. Her hands shook as she stirred sugar into coffee she had no intention of drinking. You don't have to do this, Margaret said for the third time. I know. Owen had wanted to come, but Grace had refused. This was something she needed to do alone. Well, not alone. Margaret's presence was both legally necessary and emotionally comforting, but without her protective younger brother hovering. Rachel entered at exactly 3 o'clock. She looked different, older, tired, stripped of the polish that had once defined her. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She spotted Grace and hesitated, as if considering running. Then she walked over. Grace, thank you for agreeing to see me. Grace didn't stand, didn't extend her hand. You have 15 minutes. Rachel sat, clutching a folder. I know you hate me. You should. What I did, what I helped him do to you and Elizabeth, it's unforgivable. Then why are you here? Because I need to do something right. Maybe the only right thing I'll ever do. Rachel slid the folder across the table. These are copies of settlement agreements between Dominic and 17 women over the past 12 years. All signed NDAs. All paid to disappear. Margaret opened the folder, scanning the documents. Her expression darkened with each page. Rachel continued. 3 were employees who filed sexual harassment complaints. 5 were ex-girlfriends who threatened to expose his controlling behavior. 4 were business associates who discovered his financial fraud. 2 were like you and Elizabeth. Women he planned to marry who got too close to the truth. The other three were collateral damage. Wrong place, wrong time. Saw something they shouldn't have. How did you get these? Margaret asked. I managed his personal legal affairs for 2 years. He trusted me with everything, or he thought he did. I made copies before he destroyed the originals. Grace finally spoke. Why now? Why keep this for so long? Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Because I was a coward. Because I don't know what I thought, that he loved me. Maybe, that I was different, that I could change him. She laughed bitterly. Classic abuse victim logic, right? Don't, Grace said sharply. Don't compare yourself to us. You weren't his victim. You were his accomplice. You're right, Rachel wiped her eyes. I helped him destroy lives. I looked the other way when he hurt people. I told myself it was survival, that I didn't have a choice. But that's a lie. I always had a choice. I just chose wrong. The coffee shop noise swirled around them, normal life continuing while three women sat in the eye of a storm. Margaret studied the documents. Most of these NDAs are legally binding, but if we can argue public interest, if we can show a pattern of criminal behavior being concealed, you can void them. Rachel finished. I know. That's why I'm here. These women deserve to speak. They deserve justice. Grace looked at the folder, at the names of 17 women whose lives Dominic had shattered. Have you contacted any of them? No, I didn't think they'd want to hear from me. But Grace, some of them, they're not okay. I did some research. One died by suicide 3 years ago. Another developed a severe drinking problem. Most of them changed careers, moved away, disappeared. Dominic didn't just hurt them, he erased them. Like he tried to erase me. Grace thought. There's something else, Rachel said. Dominic had an offshore account I didn't testify about during his trial. The prosecutors didn't find it. $15 million in the Cayman Islands, hidden under one of his false identities. It's blood money. Grace. Profits from fraud, from insurance policies on women who died, from settlements he collected when those women went away. Margaret leaned forward. Why didn't you mention this during the trial? Because I was terrified, because testifying about Elizabeth was one thing. But this proves I knew everything, that I helped him hide it. The immunity deal I got wouldn't cover this level of financial crimes. So why tell us now? Grace asked. Rachel met her eyes. Because I watched you in that courtroom, watched you stand up and tell your truth, knowing it would cost you, knowing people would judge you, dissect your life, blame you for not leaving sooner. And you did it anyway, because it mattered more than your fear. She pushed a flash drive across the table. Everything's on here. Account numbers, transaction histories, shell company documents. It's enough to seize the money, to use it to compensate his victims. But Grace, if you use this, the prosecutors will come after me too. My immunity deal will be worthless. I'll go to prison. The coffee shop seemed very quiet suddenly. You're willing to go to prison? Margaret asked. I'm willing to face consequences. Finally, after years of running from them. Grace picked up the flash drive. It was so small, this thing that could bring down what remained of Dominic's empire. Why give this to me? Why not take it to the authorities yourself? Because you earned the right to decide. You survived him. The choice should be yours. Grace thought about the 17 women in that folder, about Jennifer Walsh and the phone call that had broken her heart, about Elizabeth, who'd never gotten the chance to speak her truth, about her son, sleeping peacefully at home with Owen, unaware that his mother was holding the power to create justice or choose mercy. I need to think about this, Grace said. I understand. Rachel stood. Grace, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm sorry for all of it, for Elizabeth, for almost costing you everything, for being too weak to stop him sooner. Sorry isn't enough. I know, but it's all I have. After Rachel left, Grace and Margaret sat in silence. The folder and flash drive lay between them like unexploded ordnance. What are you thinking? Margaret asked. Grace watched through the window as Rachel walked away, hunched against the spring wind. I'm thinking that revenge would feel good right now. Turning her in, watching her go to prison. making her suffer the way she made us suffer. But, but revenge isn't justice, and I'm so tired of being angry. Margaret touched Grace's hand. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Grace picked up the flash drive, turned it over in her palm. $15 million. 17 women. One choice that would define the kind of person she wanted to be. Set up a meeting with the prosecutors, Grace said, and with victim advocates. We're going to figure out how to do this right. How to give those women their voices back and their lives back. What about Rachel? Grace looked at the folder, at the evidence that would send Rachel to prison. Then she thought about her son, about the world she wanted him to grow up in, a world where people could choose to change, to do better, to atone. Tell the prosecutors about the money, but not about Rachel's role in hiding it. Let them think we found it through our own investigation. Rachel wants to face consequences. Let her face her conscience. That's punishment enough. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You're letting her go. I'm choosing not to become like Dominic. He destroyed people because he could, because he enjoyed power. I have power right now. The power to send Rachel to prison or let her live with what she's done. I'm choosing the option that doesn't make me a monster too. Grace stood, gathering the documents. Besides, if she's serious about making amends, we're going to need her help contacting those 17 women. Better she's working with us than against us. Outside, the spring afternoon was warm and bright. Grace stood on the sidewalk, feeling the sun on her face, feeling the weight of the folder in her hands. She thought about that night 9 months ago when she tried to escape the penthouse, running through Manhattan streets in bare feet in terror. She thought then that survival was enough, that just making it out alive would be the end of the story. But she'd been wrong. Survival was just the beginning. The real story was what came after. The healing, the fighting, the choosing every day to be better than the worst thing that had ever happened to you. Grace called Owen. Hey, can you watch James a few more hours? We'd have some women I need to call. Because that's what survivors did. They survived. And then they helped others survive too. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, they turned their nightmares into hope. 1 year after Dominic's sentencing, Grace stood in front of a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn, watching workers hang a sign above the door. The Sullivan House. It read in elegant gold letters, below a safe haven for survivors. Beside her, Owen held James, now almost 2 years old and determined to walk everywhere on his own chubby legs. Margaret Foster stood with Detective Sarah Booth, both of them smiling at what they'd helped create. The $15 million from Dominic's offshore accounts had been seized and, after legal battles Grace had won with Margaret's help, designated for victim compensation and support services. Grace had used her portion to establish the Sullivan House, a combination shelter, legal aid clinic, and support center for domestic violence survivors. But it was more than that. It was a promise kept. The brownstone had 12 bedrooms, a communal kitchen, a children's playroom, and offices for therapists and lawyers who volunteered their time. Women could stay for up to 6 months while they rebuilt their lives. Free childcare, job training, legal representation, therapy, all of it provided without judgment or conditions. In the year since that meeting with Rachel, Grace had connected with 14 of the 17 women from Dominic's files. Some had been ready to speak, to join the lawsuit Margaret had filed against his estate. Others had needed time, needed healing before they could face their trauma publicly. Grace had respected both choices, because she understood that survival looked different for everyone. Jennifer Walsh had become one of the Sullivan House's first residents. She'd left her abusive husband, filed for divorce, and was now training to be a paralegal again. She and Grace had become friends, bonded by their shared understanding of what Dominic's legacy had cost them. 3 of the other women had joined Grace on a speaking tour, sharing their stories at colleges and conferences. Their collective voice was powerful enough that lawmakers were finally paying attention. 2 states had passed new coercive control laws in the past 6 months. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Elizabeth's family had established a scholarship fund in her name for survivors of domestic violence pursuing a higher education. Grace served on the board, ensuring Elizabeth's memory lived on in ways Dominic could never corrupt. And Rachel, she'd kept her word. She'd helped Grace contact the women, had provided additional evidence for the civil suits, had even testified in family court to help 3 of them regain custody of children taken during their lowest moments. She was still in witness protection, still living with the weight of her choices. Grace had spoken to her once more, briefly, after the Sullivan house opened. "I don't forgive you," Grace had said. "I might never forgive you, but I appreciate what you're doing now. Keep doing it." Rachel had nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will. Every day, for the rest of my life." Now, standing in front of the brownstone with her son in her brother's arms and her chosen family beside her, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Peace, not the absence of pain. The pain was still there, would always be there, but she'd learned to carry it differently, to let it fuel purpose instead of paralyze her. The front door opened. The first resident was arriving, a young woman named Claire with a black eye and a daughter clutching her hand. Grace had spoken to her on the phone 3 days ago, heard the fear and hope warring in her voice. Now Claire stood on the brownstone steps, looking up at the sign, tears streaming down her face. Grace walked over, gently took her free hand. "Welcome home." Inside, they prepared Claire's room, clean sheets, fresh flowers, toys for her daughter, a welcome basket with toiletries and a handwritten note. "You are safe, you are believed, you are not alone." After getting Claire settled, Grace returned to the front steps. The afternoon sun painted Brooklyn in gold light. Construction noise from nearby renovations mixed with children's laughter from the playground across the street. Normal sounds of life continuing. Detective Booth joined her. "Proud of you, Grace. Couldn't have done it without you. Without any of you." "That's not true. You had the strength from the beginning. We just helped you remember it." Grace watched James chase a butterfly across the small front garden, Owen following to make sure he didn't faceplant into the roses. Her son would grow up in a world still full of Dominics, still full of danger and cruelty. But he'd also grow up with the knowledge that his mother had faced the worst and survived, that she'd turned her trauma into something that helped others, that she'd chosen, every single day, to be brave even when she was terrified. Margaret appeared with a bottle of sparkling cider. "We need to toast properly." They gathered on the steps, this makeshift family born from crisis. Owen, Margaret, Detective Booth, Jennifer Walsh, and Grace holding James. "To survivors," Margaret said, raising her glass. "To fighters," Detective Booth added. "To new beginnings," Jennifer offered. Grace looked at each of them, at the brownstone behind them, at the sign proclaiming hope in gold letters. "To proving that the worst moment of your life doesn't have to define you, that there's power in speaking truth, that together we're stronger than we ever were alone." They drank. James demanded his own sip, making everyone laugh when he made a disgusted face at the bubbles. Later that evening, after everyone had left and Grace was putting James to bed in their apartment down the street, her son looked up at her with those serious eyes. "Mama." "Yes, baby." Sad. He'd started noticing her tears, the moments when the past crept in despite her best efforts. Grace smiled, kissed his forehead. "Sometimes, but also happy." "Can you be both?" James considered this with toddler gravity. "Both," he agreed, after he fell asleep. Grace sat by his window, watching the Sullivan house glow warm against the evening sky. Lights in windows where women were finding safety, where children were learning that violence wasn't normal, where healing was possible. She thought about Dominic, locked in a prison cell upstate. He'd sent her one letter. Months ago. She hadn't opened it. She'd burned it instead. Watched the paper blacken and curl. Felt nothing. He had no power over her anymore. Not even the power to make her hate him. Grace pulled out her journal, the one her therapist had recommended. She'd been documenting her recovery, her progress, her setbacks. Tonight she wrote, "Year 1 I survived. Year 2 I healed. Year 3 I build something that matters. Not because of what happened to me, but in spite of it. Dominic wanted to erase me. Instead, I've multiplied. Every woman who walks through the Sullivan house doors is proof that his cruelty failed. Every child who sleeps safely is evidence that love is stronger than control. Every survivor who finds her voice is a victory he can never take back. I am Grace Sullivan, mother, survivor, advocate, and I am finally, beautifully free." She closed the journal and looked at the photo on her nightstand. James laughing, Owen making silly faces. sunlight streaming through windows that she could open anytime she wanted. The gilded cage was gone. In its place was something far more precious, a life she'd chosen, built with her own hands, filled with people she loved and who loved her back. Not perfect, not without scars, but hers, completely, undeniably hers, and that was everything.